everyone. This is Megan Antonelli, and you're listening to Health Impact Live Digital Health Talks, where healthcare technology leaders make informed decisions. Today, I am thrilled to be talking with Mike O'Neill. He is the CEO of MedicaSoft, an industry veteran, and he has led IT teams through product launches, rapid growth phases, and acquisition integration across startups and public company environments. He's managed international teams, negotiated complex partnerships, and brings P&L accountability to engineering decisions. Experience that informs today's discussion on why architectural choices made at the foundation level determine long-term interoperability success. Hi, Mike. Welcome to Digital Health Talks.
I'm very glad to be here, Megan.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. I know we share a friend in common, Shahid Shah, who goes back to when you worked at the VA.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about your background, what you've been working on, and how you got to your role with MedicaSoft.
MedicaSoft, sure, yes. Well, actually, as you mentioned, VA was kind of the entry point for me into the world of health IT. I came there as really more of a hardware person, even semiconductor person, I would say, but came to VA to help them establish an innovation program, and that amounted to doing a lot of interesting work to bring new technology into VA healthcare. Health IT was a big part of it, working on things like Blue Button and so forth, which is Shahid would remember very well. But in any case, that's really was my introduction to the challenges of working with healthcare data. And when I moved on from VA and had a chance to start a new company, which was MedicaSoft, that's where we started, is to say, well, let's look at data and how do we solve the problem of handling data from all kinds of different systems and making it useful for people. And well, it's been an interesting road, but that brings us to today.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the VA has always been, part of the conversation in terms of all of the work that they did to kind of create those original EHRs and the systems. And of course, now with their transitions. But I think, as we've watched sort of the importance of data sort of work its way through healthcare and what interoperability means. And of course, I can't even remember when it was exactly, but when HL7 released FHIR and the work and the sort of level to which things have accelerated since then.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion around that. And I think we hear about, the vendors and the data companies talking about FHIR compatibility and what that means. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, coming all the way, from what was happening with Blue Button to now in terms of, what that looks like. Tell us a little bit about, what does the vendor pool really look like with respect to who's using FHIR and what FHIR-Native systems might mean?
Sure. Well, maybe it's worth spending a minute on what the last thing that you said there, native FHIR-Native systems versus systems that support FHIR. Just for clarity, what we mean by native FHIR is we often think these days, I'd say most people think of FHIR in terms of interoperability, its role as an API for sharing or exchanging data. But we can't forget that there's another part to this standard, that the data model, how you represent all of the different flavors of data that occur in healthcare. And FHIR, I feel like, is a really outstanding and flexible data model. So when we say a FHIR-Native system, what we mean is it uses FHIR internally as its data model, versus you may have an EHR that has had a proprietary data model for years and years, needs to support FHIR. So you add an API and a translation layer, and you're able to speak FHIR, let's say, to the external world, but internally it's something else. So that's kind of native FHIR versus supports FHIR, but not natively. And I think in the industry, there are a lot of FHIR implementations that are doing kind of narrow use cases. I'll expose an API, a FHIR API, so that an application can be integrated here. Think of EHRs supporting even meaningful use requirements for patient access. So that's good. I mean, that means that there's an awareness of FHIR out there in the industry, and there's a lot of proliferation of FHIR APIs. I think maybe we'll get into, well, where do we go from here? I think that's just a first step. I don't think that's the final step.
Yeah, and I think, you talked a little bit about, why that's important in terms of the native versus just being kind of compatible, and what that means kind of later as we look at, levels of interoperability, right? So tell us a little bit about, what that means as you go through kind of where data is used, how it gets used, and what that means across the sort of architecture and ecosystem that is our relatively very complex healthcare system.
Sure. I mentioned things like levels of interoperability. I mean, there's an almost academic way to think of it. I mean, we often talk about foundational, structural, semantic, organizational. Foundational is like, can you and I even exchange data? And I think across the industry, we have that and we've moved beyond paper and fax to electronic. But structurally, it's like, how do we format or the data that we're talking about? Is a blood pressure just a string of text I send to you, or is it a thing that has fields for stuff? Okay, we've got that. Semantic is, do you and I both mean the same thing? And then organizational is, okay, after we've done all that, can we really get the value out of the data that we were hoping? And FHIR offers a great solution for structural, I would say, and semantic interoperability. It gives us the formats, if you will, and a way to agree on what are the meanings and how do we capture the meanings in the data. And the hope is, if we all do that, then we've got the foundation for organizational interoperability. Then, we've reached a point where I've got multiple sources of data, wherever it comes from, whatever I do with it, I'm able to bring it together, understand what it means, understand the governance and provenance and so forth, and then actually use it in my day-to-day workflows.
Right, which I think is so important. I mean, I think we talk about interoperability so frequently in healthcare, and we think about it very much as organizations talking to organizations, right? And the reality is that, from the beginning, it's been also within the organization that it's hard to use the data, let alone getting to a place where you're actually pushing it between systems and all of, and making that, easy for the patient or providers outside of the system. So, we look at it sometimes and think, oh, how is it going so slowly? But it's because of the complexity of it all. And of course, this data rule in the scheme of it has been sort of, a relatively recent structure that has then allowed for this to occur. So as we look at kind of, where the Cures Act and the final rule mandates standardization and using FHIR, does that actually distinguish between FHIR-native systems and legacy platforms? Are there advantages? What's the, if you're a CIO making these decisions, what do they have to kind of compare or contrast between in terms of the compliance advantage, if any?
Yeah, so a couple of things that you mentioned in there. So first, regulation doesn't distinguish really between a native FHIR implementation versus a implementation that translates data to FHIR. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. I don't think we want regulation to dictate or try to control internal implementations. That's probably not their role. But regulations do kind of support and hopefully encourage or sometimes lead the evolution in the industry. And, in that case, you could think of ONC type health IT regulations over the years have gone from push people off of paper and fax to electronic systems, to electronic data, and provide some formats for that, CCDAs and USCDI and so forth, encourage people to move to APIs, then require them to move to APIs. And I think where we're seeing the latest ONC kind of push from a regulatory point of view is to say, well, okay, we're now going to push people a little bit out of that comfort zone where just because you can exchange CCDA documents, even if it's via a QHIN or something. We really want you to have that data be more liquid, be available, cloud-based systems accessible via not just APIs, but FHIR APIs, and not just read-only to support a few use cases, but read and write, support a broader set of data, have some performance metrics that you can actually meet so that real-world systems can use it. So I think the regulatory evolution is kind of going in that direction.
Right.
If it's not answering kind of two for one, you mentioned a really key thing along the way in asking that question, which is interoperability. We normally think of exchanging data between organizations, but internal interoperability is actually a thing that needs work. I feel like we feel at MedicaSoft, the better you're doing it with internal interoperability, the better participant you are in external interoperability. Mm-hmm. To come back to FHIR, native FHIR, and architecture, and I guess I have to tell you, Megan, I'm still an engineer at heart, so I like talking about architecture. But one of the things that we really like about FHIR as a data model is it's a very good way to implement a consistent, flexible enterprise data architecture, so that if you have a common data model for how you're going to represent data and tools that allow you to bring data into that model and share data, it helps you avoid or eliminate data silos that tend to accumulate, around an enterprise. Every time you solve a problem, you create a new database, and then you find out they don't work well together and so forth. Common data architecture with FHIR as a data model and a way to exchange data between applications as well as organizations helps you solve a lot of those problems that just cost CIOs a lot of money and generate a lot of headaches for them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and then I think about, we were just in New York this past week, and you're seeing, the island of Manhattan is soon just going to be one hospital complex where you go from Northwell to Mount Sinai to NYU Langone, as they all acquire practices, grow their buildings, acquire practices outside. So we talk about internal, interoperability, but also as you bring in other organizations through acquisition or partnership, that complexity becomes even more, or the need to do that relatively quickly, becomes even more urgent. So, I think when we think about sort of integration budgets and kind of the financial impact, I imagine that sort of having that data architecture helps quite a bit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess I would say for a native FHIR system, there's nothing inherently more complex or less complex that would say, well, hey, just if you implement a native FHIR data platform, it's just automatically cheaper. It's still a system that requires design and support and maintenance and so forth. I think the way that it helps an organization in terms of cost and complexity and so forth is by it allows you to structure how you solve all of these problems. If you're a CIO who's got to deal with the acquisition of the latest health system and integrating that data, EHR integration, supporting new clinical workflows, how does AI fit into this? I've got to exchange it. It's a lot of problems that have everything from policy, patient consent, technology, and so forth. So having some structured way to tackle those really helps. It may just help with your sanity, but it also helps with cost and complexity and being able to deploy teams effectively to solve the problems. So you can think of a data architecture as a foundational thing. So if you can say, look, I've got a common approach to my data. It's FHIR based, and then I have tools that work on that. Now, when I need to say I'm integrating a new system, a new healthcare system, I have a structured way to talk about sharing data, migrating data, and so forth. When I need to say, look, we're adding a new class of applications that involve sensitive data, how am I sure that I'm protecting privacy? You have a data structure, data model that understands how to implement things like patient consent. You're not redoing your data every single time you tackle a new problem. So I've got a foundation, and now I start to build on top of it. That's why it can be a little bit nerdy to talk about data architecture and data models and data standards, but it's really foundational to a lot of the things we deal with.
Right. Well, let's take it into the real world a little bit. So when you take that FHIR-Native architecture and how it impacts kind of system performance for clinical workflows, like what do those, if you're not using a native and you've got kind of translation delays or semantic inconsistencies, what are the friction that could then be, come about that does affect kind of patient care or provider communication? Where do you see that, happening?
Yeah. So I think there's two areas. So a native FHIR versus a translational system, there can be absolutely just raw performance delays. I have data that's accessible faster. And in a workflow where someone's making decisions, a clinician, let's say, that can matter. So a native FHIR system can provide better performance and help you in that way. I think what we found is the even bigger impact is when you don't have the common data approach that a native FHIR platform allows you to support, you end up not being able to provide all of the data that you'd like to that workflow. You have, I used the term data silos before. With data silos, sometimes you're not able to bring all of the data that you want to bear in a given workflow. And now you either just don't have a complete, let's say, patient record, or you don't have the complete context that you would like. And so it starts to limit the effectiveness or the scope of what you can put into a workflow. So there is, I guess, to recap that, there are some benefits to just raw performance.
Right.
The response time that users see in the user interface. I think there's even more impact in being able to make all of the data that you have in your enterprise available to the workflow.
Right. And, we've been talking a lot about, hearing from folks talking about, we don't want more point solutions. We want platform solutions. But the reality of healthcare, particularly right now, as new solutions are coming in faster than people can even keep up, and at the end of the day, the clinicians want them, your operations teams wants them, your administrative teams want them because they do improve performance. As you bring in new vendors or switch vendors, even, are there benefits there as well?
Yeah, sure. And, in that world of always wanting to add new capabilities, vendor lock-in, to be blunt about it, can be a real problem. So thinking about it from like the data point of view, a native FHIR solution and just a well-architected data system in general does make it easier. If you're going to switch vendors, you have a structured way to approach data migration and the incorporation of new data into the system. So it makes it easier to switch. But I think even more powerful is you are not tied to one vendor to solve every one of your problems because they're the ones that hold your data. You're kind of locked into that. One of the big benefits of a standard like FHIR, including a data model and an API, is if your data is in such a system, there's a large number of people who can then access that data and use it for everything from population health type of analytics to mobile apps for patients and computing clinical quality measures. There's a lot of work going on in the industry to do things using FHIR data. And so it's I guess it's in some industries, you would call it a best of breed approach. You can say, look, I don't have to switch vendors just to do something new because, if I don't, the vendor who has my data won't let me. You're not locked that way. You're able to make all of your data available to a number of companies, vendors, applications, workflows, and really take a kind of best of breed approach.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And as, we talk about it and we look at, the data and the importance of the data, and yes, organizations talking to each other, but the ability to look at your organizational data right now, I think is so important. And, as AI applications come in to do more predictive, work on your patients and on what's working within your organizations, I imagine that this even becomes more, that much more important in terms of the entire ecosystem of the apps and analytic tools that are coming into the organization. So, are there, when you look at that, in terms of kind of what that means to sort of look towards the future of what enterprise healthcare deployments look like today?
Yeah. So again, it's each question you mentioned so many interesting things. Let me tie the benefit of kind of a FHIR-Native platform we've talked about sometimes being performance, the ability to bring data, disparate sources of data together. There's another aspect that I think touches the future aspects that you mentioned, including introducing AI, which is improving the quality of your data. Healthcare data, as we know, and we probably all say, it's all over the place in terms of data quality and completeness. So being able to say, look, I've got a common approach. As I bring in data, I'm able to do things like implement national code sets or translate proprietary code sets to national standards, to process notes and get codable concepts, make more computable data. But these are things that are always evolving. The things that I do this year, I probably didn't even think of 3 years ago. If I have to start over from the ground up, every time I want to, improve or augment my data, that's very painful in every dimension, cost to complexity to people's time. So having a system that gives me a structured way to do that, to address data, to improve data quality without having to start over. And obviously, I think that using the FHIR standard provides you some structured ways to do this, to address data quality. That's powerful. So now, as you say, look, I'm introducing AI applications, and what I really want to do is the data that I want to make available there, I need to know the provenance of it. I need to understand the governance. I need to understand the quality. And having a data architecture gives you the structure that you can do that with confidence.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, as much as we hear about it, and, certainly in my experience with all of this, sort of coming to it and thinking, oh, wow, if these organizations could talk to each other, and how powerful it would be from a research perspective, and how powerful would it be from, a treatment and diagnostics perspective, and that we are only just now, after I won't say how many years, beginning to kind of scratch the surface on that, where we're looking at, you mentioned social determinants of health and those data sets that live outside of the healthcare organization and bringing them in, that the power of all of that becomes, kind of real and operational, and the impact is there both, and the benefit for patients and for, clinicians and, all members of the sort of healthcare ecosystem. So, what that does, and, data, the garbage in, garbage out, true then, true now. And it does feel like it just becomes that much more important as we are both collecting so much, and then using it to make, really important decisions. So as we, have a few more minutes left, and we always like to stop with, sort of end with on a very positive note, although most of this is very positive in terms of the progress that's been made. But when you look towards kind of the future and what it means, both, in the next 3 to 5 years, both this sort of rapid acceleration of technology adoption, rapid proliferation of data, and that this fundamental, adoption of FHIR-Native architecture happening across healthcare, what are some of the things that stand out as real possible, improvements to care, competitive advantages for those healthcare systems that lean in that direction? What are your, bright spots as you look to the future?
Yeah, sure. I would say this. We've said in healthcare for a while that being data-driven is important, whether we're talking about outcomes and patient health or operations and efficiency in business. And the thing that excites me, the reason I love doing what we do here, is I think we really are getting to a point where we can make that a true statement across a very broad set of data in all kinds of workflows. I think it's always been true, but a little bit narrow in scope, and every year it gets broader. You look at it as if we can help people get a good, solid data architecture, then they'll have more and better data, and they can worry less about the plumbing, if I can say it that way. Say, like, okay, that's solid. You don't have to churn that every single year. Not that you don't have to continue to work on your data, but it allows you to shift more and more focus to what am I doing with the data? What information am I extracting from it? And as they can do that, then I think they're making that statement come true. Then their care delivery and their operations are becoming more and more data-driven. And I feel like that's a great thing.
That is a great thing. And it's, I love the analogy used. We actually just sort of came out of Health Impact where we were using sort of the builders, the architects, and the data and the, interoperability where, that was the pipes and what we had to kind of, we have to build this foundation to realize the future of what we want in healthcare, which is to be able to access our data and care from wherever we are. And I think that if you use that analogy of a home or a building where, if the systems aren't, organized and recognizable, if you don't know where those, where the walls are and where the pipes are to find them, then it becomes messy. And so the idea of this native systems, being the foundation, I think is so important.
Great. I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike, so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure talking to you. And I've learned so much about all of this. And I know our audience has as well. Tell them how to contact you.
You can always find the company MedicaSoft on the web at medicasoft.com. And you can find me from there. I'm in there and I'm in LinkedIn. And
perfect. Yes, and we'll have to get you and Shahid together soon at a future Health Impact as well. Well, thanks so much, Mike, and thank you to our listeners. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation on, kind of why architectural decisions made at the foundation level determine long-term interoperability outcomes. And when that's what we want, that's important. And that difference between, FHIR-Native systems and legacy platforms with translation layers. So for more insights on healthcare technology and strategy, be sure to subscribe to Digital Health Talks wherever you listen. And that's Megan Antonelli signing off.